Ultrahand, Fuse, Ascend, Recall, the other one. These are the 5 abilities given to the player in Tears of the Kingdom, and these abilities are some of the most important mechanics in the game. These abilities are also direct counterparts to the runes from Breath of the Wild. Considering that these abilities literally change the game as much as possible, I'm gonna talk about all of them in this video. Even Build Bot, or Auto Create, or whatever that one's called. I'm gonna be going through in the order in which you unlock the abilities, and I also won't be comparing them to the runes from Breath of the Wild. As fun as it can be to compare these two games, I think comparison can take away from talking about the abilities on their own. Alright, let's go. Ultrahand is the first ability introduced in the game, and it turns a lot of the game into a sandbox. Ultrahand is most often used to create things like vehicles, and flying vehicles, and even floating vehicles. There seems to be no limit on how far the player can break the game with Ultrahand. We're seeing people create literal battle robots, and the game has only been out for a few months. Just imagine what inventions we're gonna have in a year! Experimenting with Ultrahand is pretty fun, and leads to a lot of minor accidents. Alright, let's put a fan there, and put a fan there. Everybody, I present to you this super plane. It's like a regular plane, but it has 5 fans, 2 rockets, and a hot air balloon attached to it. Let's turn this thing on. There's a tree. I wasn't expecting a tree. The good news is that after experimenting with Ultrahand enough, you'll eventually create something that's actually so worth being proud of that you'll actually give yourself a pat on the back. Either that, or you'll continue to make terrible creations forever. Okay, we've only got 1 rocket left. We're on a tighter budget this time. Super plane, prepare for liftoff. This is going surprisingly well. This might be the best thing I've ever made. It's doing really good. It was doing really good. I actually use the super plane every now and then when I need to reach a boss in the sky for a sage's will, so I guess I made something worthwhile. This ability is so innovative and so awesome that there are entire subreddits dedicated to people using Ultrahand to create Korok torture methods. There's even a 7-minute tier list on YouTube for Korok torture methods, and if that one sounds bad, there's a part 2, and this one is 11 minutes. It's a shame that Korok torture is no longer as big as it used to be, but this is just a testament to what Ultrahand can do. If there's anything Ultrahand succeeds in, it's giving the player more freedom than any other ability in the game. I'm pretty sure Japan is right next to America, so it makes sense why they value freedom so much. You actually need Ultrahand in order to make vehicles which can go to high enough areas to reach certain places as well. Places like the South Lumai Castle are impossible to reach without vehicles, which you can only create with Ultrahand, so it's not like the only thing Ultrahand contributes is being awesome. Ultrahand is definitely my favorite ability in the game, but it's not like the other abilities aren't awesome as well, so let's talk about the next one. Fuse. Fuse was the most highly anticipated ability in the entire game. Everywhere I looked, people were excited about Fuse. Sure, people were excited about all of the abilities like Ultrahand and Recall, but this is the one I heard about the most. I would say Fuse is at its peak earlier in the game, before the player can get a bunch of materials. Once you progress in the game enough, you really only have 2 options. You can either make a fun, unique weapon, or make a good weapon. All the best Fuse weapons come from combining strong weapons with even stronger monster loot. The funny little mechanics that sacrifice significant damage simply aren't worth it later in the game. For example, combining a spear to a spear is pretty funny since it makes an absurdly long weapon, which could also be useful, but it isn't worth it because base spears don't do any damage. The only exception to this would be hammers, which don't deal all that much damage, but take down bosses like the Stone Talus and Frogs much faster. And I'm very glad that the only viable difference is something that can take down Frogs. The same problem persists with fusing to arrows, but not nearly to the same extent. It's almost always a good idea to fuse a bomb flower or some sort of elemental material, but you can also fuse things like meat as bait for enemies or a puff shroom in order to confuse monsters. Although using fuse on bows and weapons is pretty fun, I think fuse is at its best when used on shields. There are a variety of things that can happen when you fuse something to a shield, and since the base stats of a shield matter more, it's actually viable to fuse a variety of things to a shield. There are so many things you can do fusing to shields, so I'm going to list a few. You can fuse a shield to a rocket to launch into the air, fuse a shield to an emitter and shoot out projectiles, attach a bomb barrel to a shield and punish enemies for attacking the player, and way more that isn't even worth covering. The worst thing about fuse is that a lot of interesting combinations are futile later in the game, and the best part about fuse is that those interesting combinations are still fun to toy around with. Now that we're moving on to another ability, I think it's time to mention the subscribe button. I mean, you're already here, you might as well press it. Alright, anyways. Ascend is the next ability we're going to talk about, and there isn't all that much to say. Ascend is definitely the most simple ability in the entire game, and it only does one thing: send the player through the floor. Ascend is a really good quality of life ability, but it doesn't really contribute that much to the overall game. If I had to guess, I would say that the ability with the least shrines focused on it is probably Ascend. You know, aside from autoplace. There isn't much to say about this one, so let's move on. Recall is also a less impactful ability than the first two, but there's still a little bit to talk about. The combination of Recall and Ultrahand is broken in shrines, since you can oftentimes hold something up in the air for a long time and then recall it to give yourself high ground. I have no clue how the developers didn't see this as a possibility, since it was pretty easy to find out. Maybe the developers did know about this combination and simply didn't care, but considering it breaks like a third of the shrines in this game, I'm going to assume they didn't. I know I said I wouldn't compare the abilities to their counterparts from Breath of the Wild, but there is a tiny comparison worth making. Since Recall is the replacement for Stasis, I think it would be cool if you could get Recall Plus and rewind enemies for a short period of time. In case any of you forgot, you could originally only use Stasis on objects in Breath of the Wild, but you could get an enhanced version of the ability which allowed it to freeze enemies as well. If you could get an upgrade to Recall that lets you rewind enemies for a little bit, similar to the Stasis upgrade, I think that would be awesome. They could put a slight cooldown on it in order to balance the ability as well, which doesn't sound that hard. All in all, this ability is pretty cool, and it used to be my favorite until I started messing around with Ultrahand a little bit more. The final ability in this game is Auto Build. I make a lot of jokes about this ability being forgettable, and most of that is because it's the only ability which isn't necessary to obtain. Although I eventually obtained this ability, it was well after I finished all 4 of the regional phenomena quests and was close to beating the game. Unlocking this ability is part of one of the best side quests in the entire game since it involves Master Koga, but I guess it's not really fair to judge an ability based on how you obtain it. Auto Build feels less like its own ability and more like an extension for Ultrahand, since its purpose is just to recreate things that are made by Ultrahand. I've obtained a lot of the Giga schematics and Schema stones, but none of those creations seem nearly as useful as the stuff you can make on your own. I also don't like that you have to use so much Zonite to recreate certain inventions, because it's not like Zonite grows on trees, and going down in the depths to obtain more of it is pretty boring. For some reason you also can't use large Zonite as a replacement for say 5 regular Zonite, which seems pretty unnecessary. I appreciate that whatever you create comes free of charge as long as the material is nearby though, that's pretty awesome. Auto Build doesn't have the same level of specialty that the other abilities have, which is why I'm not a huge fan of it. They should have made this ability Ultrahand Plus. I feel like I have to say this every video now, but I'm just scratching the surface here, since most people don't want to see me talk about the smaller details and would rather see a more streamlined opinion. Also, if you guys have any video ideas, please say them in the comments because it's not easy coming up with ideas out here. I hope I wasn't too negative in this video, especially when talking about Ultrahand Plus.